Hello, this is Alex Kotch. I'm a reporter with TYT Investigates, and I'm here to discuss my most recent article, which we published on Monday, about the fate of immigrant children, undocumented kids who either cross the border alone or cross the border with their parents, soon to be separated from their parents by the Department of Homeland Security, and then put into a shelter system. So I discovered by looking at government database of government spending that several shelters that the Department of Health and Human Services is paying to shelter these undocumented kids have very serious abuse allegations being lodged at them. In fact, one shelter even had, in the 90s, had a death of a young girl who was restrained at the time. Right before her death. There's also another government contractor, a private company in Virginia, that is being paid to help transport these kids in some shape or form. A $53 million contract. It was the latest one for this. They are also facing harassment allegations and abuse allegations. So this is something that should concern anyone, regardless of how they stand on immigration. These kids are potentially in very abusive situations, and they're not with a guardian. So I'm going to go through questions. I'm going to describe some of these allegations in more detail. I hope that more people are going to talk about this issue because, a lot of folks are aware of some of the more recent news items, like the new Jeff Sessions, / Donald Trump policy of separating kids at the border from their parents in all situations, and also the 1,500 or so missing children that HHS said they can't account for. And there's some nuances to these stories, which I'm happy to get into as I take questions. So what happens is these kids get to the border. Homeland Security takes them at that time, and then they're sent to because they're minors, they're sent to the Health and Human Services Department, which operates the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So that's the office that places these kids, or at least it attempts to place these kids with sponsors, foster families or sponsors, and then after that they can. The Health and Human Services largely does not follow up. So basically what happens is, it's almost impossible to immediately find a sponsor or a foster family for a kid. So they're going to send this kid to a temporary shelter. And from what I understand, if this is not, if they're not able to link up the kid with a foster family, then that child has to go between shelters. Constantly moving, changing environments until they're able to find a foster family. And it's in these shelters that a lot of alleged harassment has taken place, and the government continues to cement new contracts with some of these very shady shelters. And that's something that really concerned me, and I'm going to look into this with you today. So one of the shelters that I looked at was the Shiloh Treatment Center of Manville, Texas. It had a contract 2017 for about $9.1 million. That's certainly a pretty significant government contract. But also under Obama, it had a $16.6 million contract. So this is just something that Trump essentially renewed or continued. So long before these contracts happened, there were a host of physical abuses alleged by children who lived in the Shiloh Treatment Center. In fact, one child in 2001 died after being restrained of exertion. This is, I don't know if they're still restraining patients at this facility, but that's certainly something troubling. And what's even more troubling, or equally troubling at the very least, is that the same owner of Shiloh used to own another shelter called Daystar Residential, where 2 or 3 children died. 2 of those deaths were ruled homicides, and it was eventually shut down in about 2011. But this owner still owns Shiloh, and he owns several other shelters, as far as I'm aware. And he's getting government money to continue to house people. So Roland Gerodius is saying, how do they respond to those seeking asylum, much like the one that followed the policies for asylum from, I believe, from an African nation? I'm not entirely sure. What I do know is that many of the undocumented immigrants, including children and parents and adults, are crossing the border with the intent to seek asylum. Asylum from extreme violent towns they're living in, asylum, political asylum. And this is something that is much harder for immigrants to get now under the Trump administration, which is decidedly set on reducing the number of immigrants, including illegal immigrants. So, this is kind of an administration-wide effort to just reduce overall the number of immigrants, and the effect of that certainly is to reduce the number of people of color who are crossing our borders. So I've got another question here. Jenna Kuna says, does the Shiloh Treatment Center specialize in programs for immigrant children? What is the main focus of the shelter? Yes, I believe it is. I think it does. It actually treats domestic children as well. But they certainly have a pretty large operation that makes money from the government by housing these undocumented kids, and that's the government checks are the big incentive to continue doing this. I know that in some cases there are shelters that are entirely funded by this program, which is called the Unaccompanied Alien Children Program. That's it's funded by the Health and Human Services. Here's a question from Eric Byler. Why is the federal government addicted to contractors? Is it to hide the size and cost of government? Government contractors are less accountable to the people and to human rights conventions. But what's the trade-off? Why do we do this? I think in one sense, right now at least, the Trump administration is causing a large influx of unaccompanied kids, and I do believe this is partially because of the policy where they separate kids from their parents at the border. And by the way, this was happening last year too. I mean, Sessions announced that as a policy in May, but the New York Times found in April that there had been 700 kids separated from their parents since October of 2017 through April. So this is the kind of thing that is now cemented in policy, but it was happening before, perhaps on a smaller scale. The point is, with Trump's increased border security and immigration restriction enforcement, there are more and more kids who are being sent into the system, and that means that they have to find more places to house these kids. And from what I understand, even with all these private contracts, they're still kind of struggling to find places to shelter these kids because there's so many of them. If we're talking about accountability, yeah, I think government facilities should be more accountable than private facilities with not a lot of oversight. Actually, someone in the comments here wrote about I believe about a PBS Frontline documentary. Anthony Perez Vega posted about this, and if this is the one that I watched just last night, I highly recommend it. It's a PBS Frontline. It's a full hour and a half, a long-term documentary about the housing of immigrant kids. There's some really shocking stuff. And it also talks about human trafficking, which is a major issue with sort of the government agencies being able to kind of differentiate between actual parents of kids or traffickers who are posing as parents and are able to get the kids under foster care and then immediately send them to work in horrendous conditions for little or no money, or in order to pay back a debt to the trafficker at places like Midwestern egg farms. So that's I highly recommend everyone go to Frontline and watch that immediately. It's an amazing piece of journalism as well. What is their explanation for not following up on the fostering as they would in normal fostering situations? So what I understand, and this is an important point, what I understand is that the policy to not follow up is really more of an interpretation of the law. It's not actually a fact of the law. It's disputed. What the director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement said recently in a statement was that they're looking at that issue, we're looking at that interpretation of the law and potentially reevaluating it. I don't know whether there's a whole lot of truth to that or not, but they certainly come under a lot of scrutiny about this policy. And they claim that calling up the foster parents of all of the kids they put in foster care, that this is actually not required, that they did it anyway in the last 3 months of last year. And of those, I think it was around 7,000 children, around 1,500 they were not able to account for, I think based on just phone calls. So we don't know actually how many kids of those are actually, relatively okay right now, whether they're in the U.S. or not, how many of them, went into human trafficking, which is a major, disastrous problem, as you can watch in the Frontline documentary. So it's unclear, but I think what they're basically saying is that, that's our interpretation of the law, that we don't really need to bother to check on these kids once they've gone to foster homes. We'll have to kind of see it as the story develops, and I hope to be on top of this story too. If that changes, and if so, does it actually affect the lives of these kids? I got a question here from Eric Byler. There's a lot of confusion about this 1,500 children who were described unaccounted for. Ryan Grimm says these children were unaccompanied minors, that they were in our system before the family separation policy was enacted, and that they are not lost, but rather their caretakers haven't returned the phone call. So this is what I was just kind of talking about. My article suggests that once the children are separated from their parents, the Trump administration deems them unaccompanied minors, which causes me to fear that future family separations too will lead to unaccounted for children. So this gets to the heart of one of my kind of issues with the media coverage so far. I think first of all, there was a misperception over the weekend among media and also among sort of Twitter personalities and actors in Hollywood, et cetera, that yes, all of the 1,500 kids who are unaccounted for by HHS were split from their parents at the border. That's not true. But what we don't know is how many, if any, were actually of those 1,500 were separated from their parents at the border. Several publications have reported that once a child is separated from his or her parents at the border, they are considered unaccompanied alien children. In other words, they're in the exact same system as the kids who cross the border on their own. And so once you're considered an unaccompanied alien child, then like I said, you go to these shelters, and eventually hopefully HHS will find a foster home for you. But considering we know from actual data that came right from Office of Refugee Resettlement, between October of last year and April of this year, 700 kids were separated from their parents. So presumably they're put into this unaccompanied alien children bubble and then put into the shelters, et cetera. I would strongly guess that at least some of those 1,500, maybe a small minority, I don't know, but at least some of them were likely separated from their parents at the border. HHS and ORR and ICE as well have all been very tight-lipped. They haven't answered any of my specific questions and wouldn't grant me an interview. And as I said, the director of the Office of Refugee Resettlement did put out a lengthy statement recently, but he claims that none of those 1,500 kids were separated, but they haven't offered any proof, and they haven't answered my questions about confirming this idea that once the child is separated, he or she is considered an unaccompanied child. Bobby Prophet asked, how do you lose 1,500 children? Can we fire an incompetent government? So again, these aren't necessarily lost children, but they are kids who slipped through the cracks after they were placed in foster care. So one question certainly is should the agency be following up? And that's something that actually in the PBS Frontline documentary, some of the experts are asking those questions too. They're saying there's not as much oversight as there should be. They enter the country, and once they're on our soil, we're responsible for them, and we're responsible for linking the families back up together if they're separated. And we don't know to what degree the oversight is really doing anything, and how hard they're really trying, especially because they're just overloaded with many kids and many families. I'm going to do one more question and then wrap this up. Carmen Franco Colbert says, so why separate them from their parents? Why? And that's an important question. I think the government has a couple aims with this policy. One is to discourage more families from coming across the border. If the word gets out that this is happening, perhaps families will not go across the border and inevitably be separated from their kids and maybe lose them in the system and never see them again. I mean, this is something that is happening right now. They're losing there's, you know, not tracking the kids is one thing, but you know, if the government can't find where they are, there's a decent chance their parents who are separated, could be in a different state, are never going to find them, especially if they didn't come in with proper documentation. You know, this could break up families forever, and that's why, you know, I think why Carmen is and myself and other people are pretty concerned about this situation. And I think the other reason for separating them is because they want to quickly funnel the parents into prosecution. That's what Jeff Sessions said, is the goal is to prosecute anyone for crossing the border because it's an illegal act, and therefore Sessions thinks it should be prosecuted as a crime. And that's not something that was universally done until the Trump administration, and certainly until the last few weeks since Sessions introduced that idea. So there's a lot more to this story. I hope you'll read the article, which is linked in the description of this video, and stay tuned. Remember to follow us at TYT Investigates on Twitter, and my handle is at Alex Kotch. So I hope you'll follow us and continue to communicate with us with your questions and concerns and tips if you have them. Thanks a lot, and I'll be speaking to you again soon.